topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, good afternoon. Great to have you with us. I'm Bill Martinez. Welcome to the show. We're going to have Bruce Thatcher joining us in just a moment. He is the founder of History Speaks Today, and we're talking about his latest book, Too Big. Leaders of big organizations are generally shielded from effective accountability for their actions and for the actions of employees and agents. In his new book, Too Big, the 30-year veteran in marketing and management examines 5 high-profile historical and current examples of where accountability was and is flawed or missing. It shows how such people are often not subject to effective accountability by the organizations they lead. It also shows many of the ploys that were and are used to evade accountability. Bruce Thatcher joins us now. Hey, Bruce, how are you, buddy?
I'm fine. Good to be with you, Bill.
Well, always good. I always enjoy our time together. It's so thought-provoking, and especially this new book, Too Big. Tell us what prompted this book.
Well, you know, I need to give a little background first that'll maybe put it in perspective.
Okay.
Before I first started writing and I was in the Kansas City area, I often got concerned about why don't we learn from history's lessons? Because we never seem to do that.
Exactly.
And I thought about that a bit. I kept thinking about it after I moved down here to Texas to retire. And I came to the conclusion that the reason we don't learn history's lessons is because generally we're not taught history's lessons. We're taught the who, what, when, where, why of history. We march through time sequences and people and places. But nowhere, in my experience in history, with one exception, was the question of so what ever addressed.
Exactly.
So what does it mean for us today? So I decided to deal with the so what, and I established History Speaks Today. And the whole intention of all the books is the so what on some particular lesson of history. This is the 5th book. And it, like all the others, the lesson is in the subtitle. It's Too Big as the title, and the subtitle is How to Tell and How We Can Get More Accountability. And that tells you what the lesson is and what the book's all about.
You know, Bruce, you're so spot on. I've never heard anybody put it in those terms, in terms of, you know, we take a class, we get a test, we get a grade, and we move on to the next, the next objective of what the classroom syllabus says that we should do. And that's unfortunate. And I think that's a perfect reason why we don't learn, because we really don't study. We just do it just to get a grade and cover a class objective, as opposed to really drilling down and coming away with some sort of knowledge. It's almost like, in a general education class, that's what it is. It just covers it and gives you a broad brush approach. Unless you happen to decide you're going to major in history, then maybe you might have a little bit more opportunity to do a deeper dive, right?
Yeah, and what I learned, I think what I practiced practically all the way through school was what are the techniques to pass the test and get a good grade.
Exactly.
And I suspect that that's what most people experience is in approaching school. We talk about education in terms of teaching students how to think critically.
Right.
And that happens sometimes, but I think far too infrequently.
Well, and the unfortunate thing, Bruce, is there you are, you're in a classroom. I mean, depending, it could be 20, it could be 50 or so people there. And can you imagine if you exercise the cumulative brain trust of everybody in that classroom, including the professor, to address these issues? Boy, man, I'll tell you, people would get more out of history than they've ever realized before.
unquestionably. But and unfortunately, at least in my experience in the teaching of history, history was you learn these facts and you spit them back.
Right.
And I don't remember, only one exception I mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
I don't remember ever having a discussion about, well, what does it mean for us? What is it all about? That exception was a class in naval science. The history of the United States and world sea power was the subject, and we studied battles and we studied the details, and there was always a so what, because it was leading to presumably potential life situations, and saying, if you're in these situations, do this, don't do this.
Exactly. Well, in your book, Too Big, you address some key individuals, and you take them by case. Case one, we break down, speaking of so what, Robert Clive and the East India Company. Break that down for us.
The East India Company, I think it still exists in some minuscule way today, but in the 16, 17, and 1800s, it was literally the biggest company on earth. It was huge. The only thing I remember studying in history about the East India Company was the Boston Tea Party, and they threw tea overboard from their ships. But the East India Company literally had its own army. It was authorized to have its own army. It was authorized to conquer lands and do whatever it wanted to. And the subject of Robert Clive joined the East India Company as a very young man, not particularly notable in any particular area.
Right.
But he joined the East India Company and he went to India. The East India Company had a trading relationship with some of the princes of India, and he went to India as the East India Company's first as just an employee, and he quickly worked up to a position of some responsibility where he was commanding armies, fighting battles against the French and the competitors, but also against some of the Indian representatives. And he made a lot of money. And he went back. He sort of retired. He got married. He went back, and he went back to London, and he blew all the money in various fashions. And then the East India Company said, "Come back to us," and they sent him back to India again. And he literally went through the process without going into details. The East India Company in India, under his leadership, literally conquered the country.
Wow.
Their army was bigger than the army of Great Britain. Well, what happened was, of course, he got very corrupted. Some of the relationships were very corrupted. He went back to London. He was criticized. He tried to get in Parliament. He didn't make it. And ultimately, he literally probably committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
He died at a young age. But what it illustrated was one of the principles of accountability is time dynamics. Accountability relates to timely communications. In those days, communications was a 1-year cycle from London to India and back. And it allowed him to just do whatever he wanted to.
Exactly. Yeah, it's amazing. When you consider that dynamic and how it played into the role. So here he is, Robert Clive, very successful, pretty much bankrupts himself, goes back to East India Company, reinvents himself, and reinvents himself with even much more power, right?
Much more power. And if you want to point at any one person, he's probably the person that made India a colony of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, Great Britain got, ultimately after his death, some years, Great Britain took over took away from East India Company, took possession of India. And of course, the history of India, we know.
Yeah. Well, maybe if Clive hadn't been so arrogant and leveraged his control of India and turned it over to the crown sooner, he may have entered into parliament and might have had a different story. Just saying,
You're probably
right?
right. And he might have kept his millions,
Yeah.
and might have lived long enough to enjoy them.
Well, Bruce Thatcher is our guest. He's the founder of History Speaks Today. And we're taking a look at his brand new book, Too Big, Leaders of Big Organizations That Are Generally Shielded from Effective Accountability. The subtitle of the book, How to Tell and How to Get More Accountability. The next story that you break down in case 2 has always been one that I've been very fascinated with, Bruce, and that's John D. Rockefeller with the Standard Oil Company.
John D. Rockefeller was a self-made man. I mean, he came from small beginnings, and he went ultimately to the oil patch, which in those days was in northwest Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
and he worked there just a little bit. He never owned an oil well, never owned an oil well or an oil well lease. But what he did in those days is that there were a lot of little companies that were refining oil. The value of petroleum oil was as a competitor to whale oil for lighting. There was no other envisioned use for it at the time, but that was a huge market.
Right.
And so John D. Rockefeller decided that the way to and there were all kinds of price pressures. The way to keep the prices up was to control the refining of oil. So he opened his refinery in Cleveland, and he bought other refiners, and he coerced, and that was his pattern all the way through his career, was to pressure and coerce competitors to join him. If they did join him, they became very, very wealthy people. If they didn't join him, they typically were ruined because he controlled the railroads insofar as their relationships were with the oil business. When pipelines came along, he quickly controlled the pipelines. He had tankers, worldwide fleets of ships, and he was very little of what he did was actually against the law and under the laws at the time. And he was a brilliant man, did a lot of good.
How was he able to get away with that, Bruce?
Well, because he got away with it because he managed to have probably, I'd say, more audacity than anything else. He ultimately bribed congressmen. For a long time, he held off the antitrust legions in the states and of Pennsylvania and in the Congress.
Right.
And when it got to getting people out of his way, he did, or his agents did, is the more accurate thing. He did hire people, I mean thugs, to work violence on people who were competing with him.
Wow, he has his ways, huh?
He had his ways, and after the Sherman Antitrust Act was finally enacted, and they brought the case against the Standard Oil Trust. It wasn't the Standard Oil Company at the time.
Right.
It was a very interesting thing that he did, and it was copied later in one of the other cases. He set up an organization to defeat the antitrust laws and business laws of the various states they operated in. And it was called a trust. It was the first time that had been done. And he owned shares of the trust, and he just had an equal share with everybody else. But some people were more equal than others.
Right.
That was often the case.
Yeah.
And he absolutely nothing happened in the Standard Oil Trust that he didn't approve on. He knew, well, I argue he knew everything that went on. He destroyed paper trails, if you will, and had some deniability because I just own a few shares of the trust.
That's right.
After the Justice Department broke up the Standard Oil Company into a whole bunch of other companies, he ended up being for a while, the majority owner of every single one of those companies. And he became the richest man in the world after Standard Oil Company was broken up.
Wow, that's amazing. Maybe he was the one that originated the idea of plausible deniability. Bruce, what do you think?
Well, I don't know if he originated it, but he sure did it.
Yeah.
He had he went absolutely out of his way to not have a paper trail and not be associated with some of the decisions that the trust entered into. And plausible deniability was a big part of his way to avoid accountability. What can I do? I'm just one voice in all this thing. I didn't know that these people were beating up on the guys trying to build a competitive pipeline. It's a part of Rockefeller that doesn't show up in the usual history books. Ida Tarbell, in her book, muckraking book, really went into that sort of thing. But I think it's a good case of the plausibility, of the plausible deniability approach to avoiding accountability.
Well, he had to be a smart guy, Bruce. I mean, because he was like a step or two ahead of the government. The government's still, trying to get its legs underneath itself. We're in this industrial revolution. It's happening at Mach 5 speeds, and Rockefeller is ahead of it and probably realizing that he had a certain amount of time that he could get away with it until he couldn't get away with it anymore.
I think there's little question that Rockefeller was a brilliant man, a genius. He recognized where the opportunities were, and he had absolutely no compunction about doing whatever was necessary to get them. But I think that actually that's a description of almost anybody who goes into an enterprise and develops it either from scratch or going into it, works their way to the top. They all tend to be very, very smart people. They're not idiots at all.
Exactly. Well, Bruce, don't you think a little bit that they maybe understand that there's a beginning and end with all this stuff, that it will just never, keep on going? Is that you just make hay while the sun shines, and knowing that either competition could be outside circumstances. I mean, I guess in studying some of these geniuses and, emperors of industry, so to speak, is that, very few of them really, no question, they were audacious and they were arrogant and there was hubris and all that went in it. But I think there was also an element of reality that drove them as well. I don't know. Maybe I'm seeing too much, but I just think that maybe these guys are just so much smarter than we realize.
I think that, again, there surely are exceptions, but I think that it is characteristic of all the people who rise to the top that they have a wide vision, a wide range of vision. They know what's going on. Usually they know what they want to do and where they're going to go. And usually they want to absolutely maintain control of all their circumstances that they can.
Right.
The question that comes, that surely many of them come up against, is how far do I go in order to get done what I want to get done?
Exactly.
Rockefeller had the advantage that there were very few laws against any of the things he wanted to do until late in the game, as it were. Exactly. And that's not the case with some of the people who come later on.
Exactly. But he knew then, as we do now, is that it doesn't hurt to know which politicians to grease, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Rockefeller always had, we call it today, we would say, well, he had these senators in his pocket or whatever. He always, in the Pennsylvania legislature and then in the U.S. Congress, he always had people who were what we would say, as I said, in our pocket, in his pocket.
Right. Bruce, it almost is a little bit frustrating because you think, okay, if you work hard and you demonstrate merit that you can be successful, but in order to play at the levels that Rockefeller and these other leaders do, you got to understand the totality of the game that you're entering into. Is that it can be dirty, can it?
You have to understand the game, and it's even. We like to compare things to sports, and we say, "Well, it's a game."
Mm-hmm.
It's more life encompassing than just a game. You have to commit yourself to the whole thing. You have to commit when in starting a business and working a business. I have some experience at that.
Right.
And you do, surely. You have to commit yourself to 12 and hours a day, and more than that, 7 days a week.
Exactly.
You have to be willing to do everything. And they would do it. They would get it done. And I think that was a characteristic of almost anybody who works to the top. And we keep talking about, and most of my examples are corporations, but it applies to government and non-government entities just as well as it does corporations.
Exactly. Well, these, as you say, these industry titans, they understood the power of government and by getting close to it. So in some ways, the traditions of previous empires continue. And that is that, if you couldn't be king, at least get as close to the king as possible in order to garner favor and advantage, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I have, moving along just a little bit, one of the interesting cases I liked best was the one on General Electric and Ralph Kortner.
Yes. Okay.
I worked for General Electric during those years.
Oh, you did? Okay.
And it was fascinating for me to do the research on it because while I knew that price fixing trials were going on, it was sort of vaguely, I didn't work in those particular departments.
Mm-hmm.
It was incredible for me to think back about how absolutely unaware I was. I mean, I was a babe. I didn't, these things didn't mean anything to me at the time I was there.
Right.
I did refer to, and one of Ralph Kortner I think was an expert at creating plausible deniability. He created, or he reinvented and strengthened a policy called 20.5 that says it is against the General Electric policy to engage in any collusion or price fixing with competitors. Mm-hmm. Went further than that. As a very young, damp, behind the ears kind of college person, I was called into a meeting in a country club in the Chicago area, and all of our not all of our employees, but all of our marketing employees were there, and we had a presentation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, a couple more, and then a presentation from the company that says, here is our policy, 20.5, and now you sign it.
Oh.
And I had to sign it. All of us had to sign it.
Right.
And then it was mailed into New York, and, it was, okay, we'll do that. It's into New York and into the file and forget all about it. But Ralph Kortner didn't forget all about it because that was a huge defense at his trial, and the trial of the General Electric people, was that I couldn't know. I had no reason to suppose that anybody would do these things because here we have a policy against it.
Yeah. Here it is. It's documented. And like they say in a court of law, there's nothing like a document to defend your case, right?
That's right. That's right. Uh-huh. And so that was an interesting personal experience on him. One of the cases, of course, is J. Edgar Hoover. That's not a corporation.
Right.
And J. Edgar Hoover, I think, never had his eye on an end game. J. Edgar Hoover was never going to leave his job. He was the king. This was his creation, the FBI, and he was on top of it, and everybody better understand it because he was absolutely never going to leave.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And he had quite the information that he had on everybody, whether they were an enemy or not, right?
He started collecting personal information using agents to do this, and making files on anybody he thought might ever be of any use to him or any influence on him. And he started this fairly early in his career, and he just kept doing it. And after a while, there was the, J. Edgar Hoover's files. He really had them. He did really have them.
Right.
And he would use the information ruthlessly to get what he wanted. And presidents were not willing to cross him. Nobody, because he probably had incriminating information on everybody who could affect him. And there's some instances in the book where he used that information to absolutely squash senators who were opposing his budgets or anything like that.
Right, exactly. Well, the thing is, let's face it, there's just something about power and the bureaucracy and government. They're not a bunch of altar boys, not a bunch of saints, right? I mean, there's certain attributes about people who are in, that line of business.
We have, when I was in the Chicago area, I got involved in politics, and one of the things that happened is I got elected to the school board on very idealistic kinds of things, because some people came to me and said, here are things that are going on with schools, and it's awful. We need to fix them.
This is before all those bad books that they put out these days, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This was a long time ago. So I listened to all this and I said, well, yeah, that sounds to me like it needs fixing. I'll run. And there was a campaign, and I and another guy won against two people who had been on the school board from the time it was formed.
Oh, wow.
And in that experience, I learned a lot about politics. I learned to follow the money. I learned that the politics is local. The biggest interest is wherever the money is. And the school board, the school district budgets are the biggest part of all local politic expenditures.
Exactly.
And what I learned, and it was told to me, and I didn't quite appreciate it at the time, it was that when people get elected to office, they often, maybe even usually, are elected for very realistic, idealistic reasons. They really want to go and do a good job.
Right.
But then they go off to Washington, and man, that establishment sucks them in as fast as can be. And all of their, obviously there are exceptions, but all of their ideals get rationalized away because here's this wonderful stuff that they get into.
Exactly.
And the same person who was telling me that said, now it's going to happen to you on a school board. You're going to find that the company that's paving the parking lot at the school they'll do things like they'll say to you, the school board member or president, as I became, they'll say, hey, you know what? We got this job done and we have this asphalt left over. And why don't we just, I know you don't have your driveway paved. Why don't we just, otherwise I'm going to have to throw it away. Why don't we just come out over there and put it on your driveway? And you say, I mean, the normal thing, and you say, well, that's fine. It doesn't cost the school anything.
Right.
They're not paying any more because of it. I said, okay. Or the same thing with grass seed or any other thing. But then you're a bit sucked in because the next contracts come along.
Right.
And you remember.
Yeah.
And it can just get deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah, they got a hook in you.
Yep.
Yeah, it doesn't take much. It's also subtle. And the thing is, like you say, especially for these politicians that are elected, and if it's on a federal level, they go to the Beltway, and then their initial freshman orientation, they go in with all their ideology and ideas and agenda that they want to, pass, and they're all excited about it. And then the first orientation meeting tells them what the most important thing about them being members of Congress, and the number one job is to get reelected.
That's right.
And they say, and that starts today. So suddenly that's the most important thing. And as you say, it's quid pro quo, because then you find, there's a lot of backs to be scratched, because you'll get involved in a network where, one hand is helping another, and it's quite the web, isn't it?
It is. And I'm sure I haven't been in an official capacity in Washington, but I'm sure that many of the elected politicians in Washington who fall into this trap are able to rationalize every single one of their decisions and say, well, this is for the good of fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And this isn't against the law. And well, of course, I have to do these kinds of things, or I wouldn't be able to do those kinds of things. But as soon as they get into that, in my opinion, they're sucked in.
Oh,
they're part of the establishment.
Well, and the thing is, Bruce, everybody's doing it, right? I mean, insider trading, you'd say, well, it's not exactly illegal. It's kind of great. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. There's always rationalization that will allow them to feel good about what they're doing.
Right, exactly. And that breaks down the tenets of accountability right there, because they don't have to answer the tough questions because they're part of the crowd, right?
They're part of it. And the crowd they're part of, the elected officials, particularly in Washington, is accountability is kind of a hierarchical concept. Mm-hmm. That is to say, there are people who rise up through the organization, and to be accountable, you always have a boss. You always have a supervisor. You always have somebody that you are accountable to. And if it's effective accountability, that person has the ability to effect your well-being.
Right.
They can decide whether you get a raise or not. They can decide whether you get fired or not. So when there is that relationship, you have a chance at effective accountability. Mm-hmm. But elected officials, it's kind of a different sort of thing. They don't report to a person. We like to say, well, they report to the people, but that isn't a person.
Exactly.
And they have to not justify what they're doing. They have to persuade a majority to reelect them. Mm-hmm. Happens on boards of directors too.
Right.
And if you are responsible to more than one person, then you don't have accountability.
That's right.
You don't serve two masters.
Exactly.
This is a problem that we can't fix in a democracy, because we believe very strongly that the people should decide who represent them. And so you have this question of what do you do about elected leaders in terms of accountability? What do you do about corporate presidents in terms of accountability who will report to a board of directors? That's a number of people. Mm-hmm. Well, there are some things I think you can do. I think we could suggest in terms of elected officials, but why don't we have term limits?
Yes, right. Yeah.
But that's not going to happen.
Right.
That's not going to happen. We're going to have to do our best with our elected officials to impose or demand an accountability. And to do that, we're going to have to keep their feet to the fire. We're going to have to ask them questions. We're going to have to force them to face up as much as we can to decisions they've made.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, I think also what we realized here recently, and that is preserving the integrity of the vote, to make sure that every vote counts. I mean, you talk about non-accountability and you talk about everybody doing it, so it shouldn't be a problem. And that is where there's ballot stuffing, there's manipulation of the ballot that's going on from state to state. We suspect it. Do we know? Do we have hardcore evidence? We have some indications. There's lots of smoke out there, but there's not enough interest to really look into this. But if this is truly going to be a government of, for, by, we the people, if you and I have discussed many times, well, then the power needs to be back in the hands of we the people. And if the vote is the most important thing that we have in which to maintain said power, then we need to honor that vote to make sure that there is integrity, that there's free and fair elections, that votes aren't getting canceled because illegal immigrants are allowed to cast a vote, or you got ballot harvesters who are going into nursing homes where people can barely speak a sentence, and they're getting a ballot from them, or putting their name on the ballot. And that's not even to mention people who have died, like in California. I mean, they got people on the voting rolls that have died, and it's pretty amazing in California. I think that I find it quite interesting that people can die in California as Republicans, and the Democrats are able to raise them from the dead and get them to vote Democrat.
I don't know whether that's a California innovation. When I was living in Chicago, you were very much aware that
right.
the Democratic machine voted a lot of people from the graveyard.
Yes. Yeah, that was the saying. My good friend down in South Florida, who worked in the machinery of Chicago politics, he always said when they thought that the vote was over, they'd say, "Wait, we have to get the cemetery vote."
Yeah, that's right. Election shenanigans are not new to our current times.
No.
They went on way back in history.
Well, 1700, Bruce, I was looking back. I said, how long has voter fraud been going on? And what spurred it on, of course, was, the former Attorney General, Eric Holder, who swore, he looked in the camera and said, there's no such thing as voter fraud. And even then I'm going, how could there be no such thing as voter fraud when people are getting arrested? They're spending time in jail for voter fraud. How can an attorney general make such an ignorant statement?
I think too many politicians, well, first, they're experts at what they do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
They're experts at what they do. And I think too many politicians understand very clearly that Hitler was perfect at it. The great lie, tell it often enough.
Oh, yeah.
And people begin to believe it.
And the bigger, the better.
The bigger, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And a thing that I think is a very strong factor is our increasingly diminished attention span.
Oh, yeah.
We don't. A lot of I argue a lot of people can't think past next week, but yeah. we don't tend to think about the future, and what that happens. That works well for incumbent politicians because they can practically rely that the electorate will not remember things they've said and things they've done when it comes time to the next election.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what you do about those things. As I said before, how about term limits?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
we can talk things like that, but of course they're not going to happen. They're not going to happen.
Well, we're told in the Bible in Daniel 12:4, and I've always appreciated this, Bruce, because I think this is where we are right now. It says that even in the time of the end, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. Well, here we are in the information age. We've got incredible power in the palm of our hands and our cell phones, and that information is there. But as you said, I think we're so overwhelmed by the information that we have failed to become discerners of the right knowledge that are going to render the right results. Does that make sense?
Yeah, every bit of it. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that back in the days when our information came to us, not quite as fast, not mm-hmm. quite as on the scene kind of thing, but it came to us in print form usually, and we learned to read and we learned to read it. and we didn't have 100 or 1,000 different impressions to deal with in the same sphere of time.
Right.
I think that we did a lot better at figuring out what was actually going on. We didn't know as many things, but the things we knew about, we tended to know about in more depth.
Right.
And I think the tremendous volume of information, the smartphone mentality, and all of this kind of thing. Oh, I got to see it. I got to see it. It is not true that you can multitask on several things at the same time. You can switch back and forth, but if you got all that stuff going on, it's really tough. It's really tough to get into it.
Well, and on top of that, Bruce, the knowledge or at least the information, let's say information that's being poured out there, how much of it is misinformation? I mean, we've got the government claiming, other people are purveyors of misinformation when they themselves continue to lie at every turn, and they want to establish, a department of misinformation and going, I mean, you guys are propagandists yourself. So, I mean, this whole idea, but this is why we, the people, must step up. And you've heard me say this before. I always encourage our audience, you must own your own knowledge. Don't just take our word from it. Fortunately, we have people, we're so blessed to have people with the experience like Bruce Thatcher, historian, who brings weight to the topic. And it's up for you. Hopefully you're motivated enough to say, you know what, I'm going to check this out myself and know for myself, so that when I address this issue, I'm not speaking with the depth of a bumper sticker or an 8-second soundbite, right?
Right. Looking, one of the things that reporters do, good reporters do, is they look for corroborative information. They want more than just this one statement of a fact. They want other statements that tend to corroborate that thing, and then they can begin to build what I was taught in journalism. They begin to build what is a credible story.
Exactly.
I think that doesn't happen as much as I'd like it to happen today, but we can do that as individuals. My sister's a doctor, and years ago she said to me, "You're responsible for your own health, nobody else." And that applies to your own well-being, and that applies to your own information. You're responsible to make sure that you're getting the whole story as best you can.
Exactly.
And when you concentrate and you take all of your news in terms of sound bites and headlines, and don't read down to the third paragraph and all this kind of thing, you're not living up to your responsibility, in my opinion. And we all do this in some areas.
Yeah.
But today it just gets overwhelming. The advent of social media has made this just kind of the standard way we go about our daily lives.
Yeah.
And social media is, of course, the fifth case in the book has to do with Mark Zuckerberg.
Right.
And Mark Zuckerberg, again, was brilliant. He's a brilliant person. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He is arguably also well-intentioned. I mean, you get into debate about things, but he's not a bad person. But he's like Rockefeller. He controls absolutely nothing happens with Facebook, Meta, and their other platforms that he does not approve of.
Right.
And you can read in this case how various things that were happening caused him real anguish, but he always responded in terms of, well, how will it work out for me? And we'll set up an algorithm to do this or whatever it is. And he never claimed to be associated with one ideology or another, but things tend to come through.
Right.
And social media is one of the greatest blessings of our age, and one of the greatest ills of our age, because of the way we as people allow it to take care of us.
Well, we also, Bruce, we only got about 5 minutes left here, but we also end up identifying with people that we really don't know. It's almost like we imagine something about them, and we're really not dealing with reality in some of these cases, and we find ourselves taking other people's words for word for it when they themselves haven't either they haven't been forthright about their intention. I think Mark Zuckerberg made it real clear in the last election what his intention was. I think I'd be curious to find out that if the winds, came from a different direction for him that would serve him more directly, I'd be curious to see if he would suddenly become conservative.
Well, as it gets older, maybe, but I think that some of the things that I think you need to do, particularly to improve the accountability question, is update a little bit of the wording in the Sherman and various other antitrust acts so that they're brought in. Mm-hmm. Remove that shielding they have that allows them to say, well, we're just a media, we don't have any control over what's there. And I suggest
that Article 230. I agree with you 100%. Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
But again, that's a plausible deniability instrument institutionalized.
Exactly.
By law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we need to change it.
Well, and of course, it cost them some money, and here it is. And of course, it served them well. And especially now when they've aligned themselves with one party, the party that happens to be in power. So it works very effectively. Bruce Thatcher is with us, and we're talking about his new book, Too Big: How to Tell and How to Get More Accountability. Bruce, in these last 3.5 minutes that we have together, I'm going to let you summarize and help us understand what the takeaway should be and what we should draw from this, because accountability starts with me and you, doesn't it?
It does. We each of us have our own chain of accountability. We're mm-hmm. accountability to somebody or something. Those who have deep religious beliefs feel an accountability to the God, but Rockefeller was one of those. And that's mm-hmm. easy to rationalize away.
Right.
And I think there's always the temptation to do that. Mm-hmm. I think what we have to do is realize that we want accountability, even from powerful people. Realize it's a very natural thing for them to be in a position of power so that they can avoid most accountability. It's right. Natural. It's not evil. Mm-hmm. People behave that way. And then understanding that, say, well, what can we do to improve the accountability of those situations? What can we do about the relationships between boards of directors and chief executive officers? What can we do between the relationships of independent agencies in the government mm-hmm. and the entities to which they presumably report, but they never do?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And think about those things, and there are some things we can do. Mm-hmm. We cannot make everybody accountable. Individuals will be accountable as much as they want to be, or feel that it's in their nature to be, or as much as they feel it's the right thing to do. But there's always going to be powerful people who rationalize around those things or deliberately go around those things.
Exactly.
So let's do the things we can. And there are some.
Well, Bruce, I believe that there needs to be a clear infrastructure. I believe we have some of those, they call them laws and other boundaries that need to be adhered to. And when said laws are violated, then there needs to be immediate punishment. It's like the book of Ecclesiastes says that because, punishment, or sin is not punished immediately, it gets complicated. It snowballs. And this is where we are right now, is that accountability is something that must be exercised with more of a sense of urgency, is the way I read it. Bruce, I'm going to let you summarize and take us out right now to wrap everything up in terms of a final conclusion. Go ahead.
I think I think that we ought to understand the nature of accountability at high levels, and we ought to understand that we need to change laws in particular to improve that accountability. And the changes are not very great, although they would be very significant. I think we need to do those things. One of the things I think we need to understand is, oh, well, we have a law against that. You know, what so-and-so company got fined $1 billion for thus and such. That's pocket change.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pocket change. It doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to make I don't like to call it the punishment. We need to make the results fit the situation so that they cause, or so that people will be aware of them and behave in a more accountable fashion.
Exactly. Well, Bruce Thatcher, author of the book, Too Big, How to Tell and How to Get More Accountability. The book is available at all the usual places, and you can go to Bruce's website. Bruce, the website for our audience?
The website is historyspeakstoday.com, and you can find all the books there. You can find all the links to where you can get them, and we're happy to see you join it.
Well, Bruce Thatcher, I cannot thank you enough. Appreciate the time, my friend. You take care.
You too.
Our thanks to Bruce Thatcher for being with us today. For more information and to be a part of this mighty Martinez movement to return to God and to save our country, go to BillMartinezShow.com. May God bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, and may he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a great day.